Okay. So I want to thank you all for joining us today for this great opportunity. We are very honored to have David Bainbridge join us today for this SDG&E sponsored community presentation on buried clay pot irrigation. Dave grew up in the West. After earning a BA in Earth Sciences at UC San Diego in 1970. He moved north to UC Davis to complete an MS in ecology in the multidisciplinary EcoGrad program. He completed the coursework for a PhD in ecology, but was unable to develop a workable committee for his proposed thesis on ecological community design. He started a company doing environmental impact analysis and then transitioned to a solar research and design firm, Living Systems, where he worked on community design for resource conservation, rainwater, passive solar heating and cooling, building codes, and solar rights, described in part in his Rodale Press book, Village Homes. He started work on straw bale building systems in 1985 with a consulting project for a farmer, an interest that eventually led to the completion of books The Straw Bale House, which I happen to own, and Passive Solar Architecture with Ken Haggard. David started research and consulting in desert and dry land restoration in 1981 and continued his work at the University of California, Riverside, San Diego State, which is where I met him, and Alliant International University until retiring in 2010. His special focus was on understanding the impacts of disturbance on root development and growth and efficient irrigation for remote sites. He is author of A Guide to Desert and Dry Land Restoration and Gardening with Less Water, which I have read. And I anticipate this will not be a dry presentation, and that's a pun intended. David, take it away.
Thanks, John. Well, it's nice to have a chance to talk to you and show you some of the things I've developed over the years and learned from people around the world. All right, let's advance now. And it's particularly important now with the water shortages around the world, and climate change is just going to make it worse. It's estimated there are 330 million farmers who have less than a hectare of land, and many of these people have very little water as well, or water may have to be carried from quite a ways away. In some of the drier parts of Africa, one person in the family is assigned to bring water, basically, so they're carrying water all day just to meet the family's needs. And the Colorado River locally is running out of water, as you've seen probably in the newspapers. The bathtub ring keeps getting bigger and bigger, and there's some concern that they'll run below the intake level. So here's a recent map of world water stress. And if you look at the US, it's just kind of a mild water stress. The biggest issues are India, Pakistan, through the Mideast. But if you look at a recent map of drought from Drought Monitor, the US is as bad off as any place else. It's really a difficult future for water. And around the world, there's places like this. This is the Tari village in Jordan. It gets about 7 inches of rain a year, which is what we had in San Diego last year. That's a place where they really need vegetable gardens, they need fruit trees, and the clay pot irrigation is one of the few ways they can actually do that with the water they have. So in 1984, I started the Drylands Research Institute at UC Riverside, and one of my side projects was to find out more about super efficient irrigation. And we talked to people when they came into the Institute, and we did an enormous literature search and found the oyas, or clay pots, sometimes called pitchers. It can be a little confusing as you try to track it down across the world. Porous capsules, which is like a double-ended clay pot. porous clay pipe, and I'm doing an article right now with a scientist from Sudan and another from Pakistan on their research. Deep pipes, which just get water deep in the soil. And I've done quite a bit of work recently on wick irrigation. Everybody knows about drip, but drip irrigation has a lot of problems in remote settings. It's easily clogged, it gets chewed on by about everybody, and it must have a good mouthfeel, because some of our desert sites, they were chewing up the drip tubing even if it didn't have water in it. Just felt good, I think. And even on one site, they ate all the spaghetti tubing, so we realized that's why it was called spaghetti tubing. And the drip irrigation generally provides very little protection if something fails, that there's not much water in the system. So if the water goes down, damage can occur pretty quickly. So my work on clay pots and pitch irrigation all came about from Fan Shengzi and his textbook, which was written more than 2,000 years ago. Unfortunately, we just have fragments of it, but one of the fragments described clay pot irrigation. And he had been tasked by the governor or the emperor to provide information for farmers with too little land and too little water. And he was unusual for a noble because he'd come from a regular family. He'd grown up on the farm, so he was particularly good at talking to people and finding out what worked and what didn't work. So what he suggested was you should have 215 soil pits per acre. And at the bottom of each pit, you should have a buried earthenware jar to provide the clay pot irrigation. So these aren't Chinese pots, these are from Texas, and from a potter who did a really nice job of making them a little fancier, but alas, also more expensive. And we also found examples in India, and here they've got the clay pots combined with wicks, which got me started thinking more about wicks. Useful for trees, as you see in this picture, but also very good in the garden. And the clay pot irrigation works so well because the water flows through the clay by capillary action, and its flow rate is determined by demand.
I guess I gotta turn on the audio.
Yep.
Sorry, I don't know what that was.
Somebody's trying to
I
get
don't
the
know
audio.
where the audio is down here, I guess.
Well, hold on a second and see if you can get that audio to work. So
Yes,
as
it's okay. It's got
Okay, you got it?
captions.
you got audio. So it makes it very.
Sound. I think my sound is down here. There it is.
Here we go.
There it is. It's on.
Are you there? Okay, so as a demand responsive system, it is extremely efficient and highly recommended for gardens, landscaping, and specialty farms. Tends to be a little expensive for really broad use. So here's a commercial firm, Grow Oya, which of all things is based in Canada. And this is a Oya used for irrigation down in Mexico. As we interviewed people who came through the Drylands Research Institute, many people knew about this system, but no one would study it because it was traditional. It was primitive. So they were studying sprinklers and drip systems and things that required electricity and filters, and ignoring the things that people actually were doing. So what I recommend is getting started with clay pots, something that John has done. Oyas can cost up to $30 each. So if you did a garden with 20 Oyas, you're out $600 for Oyas. That's pretty stiff. When you can get the clay pots for $4 or $5 a piece, and you can get rubber stoppers to fit the holes from various places, including Amazon, or you can fill the hole in the bottom of the pot with epoxy or hot melt glue or other things. And sometimes the holes in the bottom of the pots aren't round, so to get a cork to fit, you may have to round out the hole a little bit to make it fit better. They come in all sizes, of course, so you can do big ones or small ones. I've done a few demonstration pots with just the 2-inch clay pots, and that's kind of fun to show people. And there's a really nice video I found online of 2 Indian girls explaining how clay pots work in a little tiny earth container. And you can put the cork in from the top or the bottom. I'd like to put them in from the top. Then if it looks like the plant's getting a little stressed, you can pull the cork out and wet a bigger area under the clay pot. Over here is a little hole in case it rains. Not something we worry about much in San Diego anymore, but if it does rain, you want to capture that nice, fresh, unsalty water. So here's how I did them with epoxy. Just put some masking tape on the bottom, on the inside, and make a little pool of epoxy. And they last forever. For our desert work, we like them to have them really tough. And pretty easy to install. About the only concern is sometimes the clay in the pots is fired a little too hard. And you can see that the color is a little different and it won't wet. So if you are going to buy a bunch of pots, it's worth taking along a wet rag or something, and you can make sure that the clay is not too high fired. And we set the pots in the soil, so just the rim is above the surface of the soil so you don't get stuff washing into it. And you need to firm the soil up around so it gets good contact with the pot. So here's what I've got now in the backyard from earlier this year. We're putting in the pots for this season. I've got the pot bases on upside down just to keep the dirt from going into the pots while I was setting it up. And you have to remember to leave access on some point so you can lift the lid and fill it up with water. Works really well with seedlings as well as seeds. So these were just seeds put in, and you get very high level of germination. So here's the garden a little bit later this spring. The chard's going crazy. We're not keeping up with it just with 2 pots of chard. It's really more than we can do. And other herbs, chives, and other things going to town. And this has been really helpful for me. This is a kneeler from Garden Supply. My knees aren't what they used to be, so this makes a nice cushion bed for working in the garden. If you've got some older gardeners in the Lemon Grove group, it's a really nice thing to work with. So here again is the hole drilled in the pot. The rim has been painted white, so there's less evaporation. It's really not necessary to do, but it helps you see the pots if you've got them out in a remote area like we often do. And we found that sometimes it's cheaper to buy plates to cover the pots than it is to buy the pot bases. So sometimes plates at Goodwill are just 50 cents each, which is pretty good. And to see how far out you can plant the plants, it's best to fill the pot with water, let it sit overnight and see how far out it wets the soil. And then you have an idea how far away from the pot you can plant your plants. And almost everything we've tried has worked well with the clay pots. This is basil going to town. Flowers, tree seedlings, just about everything works really well for intercropping. But the only thing that hasn't worked at times is really fast growing big vines like pumpkins and squash. They need more water than you can get from the little 8-inch pot. So you might need something big like this Deep Spring Zoya, which is quite substantial. In our desert work, we often just refill them once every 2 to 4 weeks or even further apart. But in the garden, it's often just once a week, twice a week, perhaps, when the plants get larger. How often do you have to fill yours, John?
Well, in this weather, yeah, I was going to talk more about that later, but it really
Okay.
varies on the pot, how fast each one goes down. Some I only have to do once a week or less. Some are more like twice a week. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, that's been sort of my experience as well. And if you don't want to be filling the pots all the time by hand, you can actually set it up with the drip emitters and essentially a drip system to fill the pots. So done that a couple of times for people who didn't want to be out pouring water in their pots once a week. So you can install a regular riser, a multi-head riser, and put the adjustable emitters through the clay pot lid. Worked great. And we've heard of people putting in a valve so it automatically filled the pots when they got down too low. One of the beauties of the clay pot system is the fact that you don't water the weeds. So in a study I did up at the Tree of Life Nursery, thanks to Mike Evans and others for letting me do it, we had 200 pounds of weeds per acre of clay pots and 8.5 tons of weeds with flood irrigation. So this was an old garden area with just weeds of all kinds. But with the clay pots, they just didn't get any water. So we had almost no weeds. And that's been the experience around the world, that if it, particularly areas without rain, there are almost no weeds. And this is really important, not only here, but in other parts of the world where the big problem is time. People don't have time to weed. They don't have time, perhaps at home, they're out working for a small amount of cash somewhere else. So if you can do it without weeds, it really pays off. One of the things that's always a surprise is to find out maybe you have more snails than you thought you had, and they end up in a ring right up against the pot. So it's really easy to pluck all the snails out, or slugs, and hopefully you've got some ducks to feed them to. Their pots may need to be cleaned at the end of the year. Sometimes they're not. It depends on the soil and how much salt there is in the water, how much calcium. But I tend to wash them every year, scrub them a bit. And if they have a lot of calcium, I'll soak them in some vinegar. And then to remember to store them upside down so you don't get any mosquitoes. It's the other reason to have lids on the pots, is for mosquitoes. So they've worked out really well in areas with salty water or salty soil. In one of the studies in India, the tomato yield was higher in the pitcher-fed salty soil than in the regular soil with conventional irrigation. So it tends to work pretty well, but you can see how much calcium and salt is building up here on this pot. And I thought I'd invented this doing the double clay pots for cuttings. And not too long after I patted myself on the back, I saw this in the Liberty Hyde Bailey's nursery manual from 1920. So it's got the sealed clay pot inside a larger clay pot, and it provides just a beautiful moisture level, oxygen level for cuttings and for seeds. It really works extremely well. So here's the setup for willow cuttings for one of the projects. And you can see it's just the sealed pot with a lid, just like you do in the garden, inside a second larger pot. And it's just tremendous results. You can see basically all the willow cuttings have sprouted except this one. And some are already getting catkins. They're really happy. They're great in container irrigation. Here you can see just barely the big ornamental pot, and inside is a sealed, well, not totally sealed, but clay pot with the hole filled in the bottom. And this worked just great. This is over at the Lyon International University in front of my office. And just great, the flowers. Also very good for interior watering because you're very less likely to have leaks and get water onto a hardwood floor if you've got the water contained in the interior pot. So when I scrub the pots at the end of the year or every couple of years, just a regular scrub brush, a little vinegar in the water to help. And if there's calcium deposits, then I'll soak them overnight in water and vinegar solution. And you can get the higher concentration vinegar at Home Depot, so you don't use up very much. So how efficient are they? Well, a recent study in Kenya, the clay pots cut the water use for tomatoes 97%. And they increased the yield 40%. So that's pretty hard to beat. And that's not unusual. When I did my first report on clay pots back in 1985, I estimated that you could get 90% reduction in water use and 30% yield. So I've been beat. My early estimates weren't as high as it could be. And one of my goals has always been super low water use. Many of our restoration sites were very hard to get to. So we had to get every drop of water to do as much good as possible. In other parts of the world, water is getting carried in from far away. And I wanted a system that was good enough that you could grow at least a few vegetables around the house or a fruit tree with water that was carried by hand, or if you're lucky, carried by donkey. And this is Peru. So for more information, gardening with less water is the simple version. And if you want to see more detailed studies of all these different types of irrigation, you can go to this website, which is just worksbepress.com, David A. Bainbridge, and there's a bunch of papers there in more detail and access to literature from around the world. And for bigger picture items, this was my 10-year project doing a guide for desert and dryland restoration. This is Chaco Canyon, and in places like that with 10 or less inches of rain, it's really hard to beat clay pots. So that's a very straightforward overview to clay pots, and I'll open it up to questions and comments. John, do you want to show your pictures?
Yeah, I'd love to show my pictures. Yeah, okay, let me start sharing here. Can everybody see this Amazon page?
Yep.
Yeah, well, I'll get back to that in a minute. See, these are the photos. This is Jacob putting water in one of the pots. This one, you can see all the, excuse me just a minute. Hello? Yeah. I'm on Zoom. Okay, bye. Okay. Sorry. And you can see there's about, over on this right picture, you can see there's about eight pots here that we staggered in their position. And they have plates that we got at the Goodwill, kind of colorful plates that we put on top. You can see the drip line that we had in, we pulled it on to over to the end. It hadn't been removed yet, the brown drip line. There were some strawberries in there before we cleared everything out, so we left those strawberries. And then we covered everything, as you can see, with a nice mulch to help keep the water in the ground. And this is a 4x10 bed at the Lemon Grove Community Garden. This is after we planted, and you can see how nicely things are growing. We have sweet potatoes. There's a fennel plant I transplanted into here that I didn't think was going to survive, but it seems to be doing okay. And the corn now has doubled in height from this picture from a few weeks ago. And see if I have any others here.
Yeah, I've had really good luck with strawberries, and they're happy with the clay pots.
Yeah, they seem very happy. I ate a couple yesterday at the garden. These are the rubber stoppers that I bought from Amazon, and here's a little pack that I got. I got 2 of them left. They come in 12, as you can see. So they were a little more than $1 each for these. This is the right size for the 8-inch terracotta pots. And the here, I gotta go back here. This is the end of a broom handle that's kind of tapered that I used to wrap some sandpaper around, and you just kind of remount the hole in the bottom of the pot. And it's the clay is very soft, so it only takes less than a minute to kind of ream that hole out. And the pots at the garden, one thing I've noticed is that some of them drain a lot quicker. One of them quite quickly. I think that maybe the cork wasn't sealing that well, so I pushed it in better, and it seemed to help, but it's still draining pretty fast. So I might take that one out and kind of re-engineer that one. But one thing I have noticed is that there is quite a different rate that the different pots seem to drain in general. And I was going to ask you, Dave, if you're seeing that, or do they generally drain at the same rate?
Yeah, typically they've been very consistent, but there are outliers. There's some that don't drain at all, hardly, and some that, as you found, are a little more leaky. So what I'll often do before I put them even in the garden is just line them up outside the garden bed, fill them with water, and see how fast the water goes down. So it's usually related to the cork, but sometimes the clay is fired more or less, and it's just a good idea to check to make sure that's going to work.
I see. I have other questions, but I want to open up the field here for anybody else that might like to ask Dave some questions about this wonderful system. Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I have a real quick question.
Sure.
I missed it. I'm playing my bass here while I'm listening. Oh, sorry about that. But the hole in the pot that you're drilling, the little tiny hole, what's the purpose of that?
To let rainwater in if it rains. So you capture the rainwater. Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted. I said, yeah, that makes sense. So you're capturing rainwater. I was thinking that maybe that kept so that the water, if it's evaporating or something, it has escape.
Yeah, no, that's it. And
Okay.
for the high-fired china plates that you might get at Goodwill, you may need a glass bit instead of just a regular drill bit.
Yeah, they'll shatter.
For the terracotta, it's surprisingly easy to deal with.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a little more expensive and less decorative.
Yep. Exactly. And the other advantage is there's a little more evaporation if you have the clay base rather than a high-fired plate. Probably not enough to make a difference. Other questions?
Susie, it looks like you wrote a question in the chat. You see that, Dave? You see the chat?
I
Yes.
had to figure out how to unmute.
I see
Yeah,
5
the
chats.
question was, is the main idea of this for areas without potable water source? Or is the main idea to eliminate using plastic drip irrigation tubing and so on?
Well, there's that as an advantage. The main reason is just to get the most out of every drop of water. It's just the most efficient system that there is. Comparison to burying drip, even, it seems to be as much as double the efficiency of subsurface drip. And no plastic waste, something you can make even in a village in Africa, and no big disposal problem when it's over with. Really hard to beat. There's a nice study done in
That sounds
Ethiopia,
really good, thank you.
where they put out 15,000 clay pots for people, and it was to help with their home gardens and fruit, and worked out quite well.
And anything with the water in the clays, like any fertilized, is it just water?
Just water, although people do put fertilizer in, but it can clog the pores in the clay, depending on what type of fertilizer you might use, or if we start to get some algae growing in the pots, it could affect the porosity. So by and large, we don't tend to put worm castings or something outside the pot, but not in the pot. Good question, though.
Thank you.
Along those lines, I was wondering if you could actually have like an algae, kind of combine two different concepts where you maybe are growing algae in some kind of pond, and it's a porous containment, so that you're actually also watering the surrounding area around the pond. I think maybe earlier in the presentation you spoke about that. I might have been distracted. Did you talk about having like larger containers that are also acting as a diffusing water?
No, not so much. Just the outer container was to hold the soil for you to grow cuttings or container plants, essentially. But nothing really big. The only one I mentioned, excuse me, was the nice Hindi girls demonstration. They just had a small container of soil and then the clay pot and the plants growing in it, so they could take it around to school and show people how it worked.
Oh, I see. Good. How large an area can you get with just the clay pots before you may feel you need to move to, let's say, a porous capsule that's fed with tubes? I mean, is it practical in some of these other countries? Do they do large acreages with just clay pots, and
They
then they have
yeah.
to go out and manually fill each pot, right?
Yeah, they have. Yeah, they've done it. There's limits, though, as you might imagine. So one of the things they're doing with the porous clay pipe is that it's a little easier to automate. So you can just put the water in one end of the pipe and it trickles through the pipe, and you don't have to do each plant. But you also get more weeds because you're wetting areas where there aren't plants. So it's all these are trade-offs of various kinds. But the porous clay pipes have been really effective. And one of the most important studies was done in France back in the 1930s. And if the war hadn't come, maybe people would have gotten to see this research, but it just kind of disappeared. But they had a very nice field trials of porous clay pipe that just did extremely well, much like the clay pots.
You mentioned how the pots, with the pots you get less weeds. What's the main reason for that?
Well, you're just not wetting the soil where there are no plants. So the less potential for seeds to germinate and for the weeds to grow.
I see.
When you flood irrigate, a lot of water is wasted, just evaporates from the soil surface. Although with mulch, it helps. And I'm glad you showed that example. One of the things you can do is, maybe it's super good now, but it can be even better if you use mulch in addition to the clay pots. You can save another few percent of water by doing a really nice mulch.
Yeah, Walt's been good. Walt here is the director of our community garden. He's been good about promoting the use of mulch. And Walt, I was going to ask you right now, we're using the drip lines. How often are we set the timers to water with the drip lines?
Yeah, it depends on the season. The hot weather, we're using about 3 times more water than in the winter here in Lemon Grove. And so what we were finding was that because our bed has 4-foot width, we put down 4 drip lines. And we were finding that a lot of times the water was, and we keep the drip lines at the surface and then we mulch over it once the plants are established or the seedlings. But what we're finding is that water was percolating down, which it should. You need it to percolate down some so that the salt doesn't build up. But what we're finding is it was percolating down pretty quick when we're doing every other day. So we switched to every day. And then in addition, we switched twice a day. So in the winter, it's like 3 minutes twice a day. And in the summer, it's like about 7 or 8 minutes twice a day.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to compare the water use with those versus the pitchers. And
Well,
see how they vary. That'd be very
We'll
interesting.
have to quantify that with John, making a log of the size of the pots and the frequency.
Yeah, that'd be good to do. It hasn't been done very often, so it's always useful to get a better idea how that works.
I think the main reason that we started with the drip lines is because the garden is set up. We have 41 beds. They're all the same size, the same soil. We wanted to make it easy for gardeners to succeed. So we put in drip systems for two reasons. One, because it's automated, it's on battery timed valves. So that gardeners wouldn't have to lose their crops in the summer if, it's hard to get there every day, every other day. So,
Yeah, exactly.
most gardeners can come like a couple times a week or even once a week and still be successful. And then it's less water wasting than if you're watering by hand, or if we've got sprinklers, things like that, waste much more water.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
But it's interesting to see how the Oyas are working, and my guess is that you're cutting down, at least you're using less than a third of the water that we're using for the drip, even though drip is pretty efficient once we get the mulch in there.
Yeah,
I think the Oyas are more efficient. The issue is, would the individual gardeners, some of whom, are newcomers, would they be able to keep up with coming and filling those pots?
right.
So
right.
it's something to consider, and it's something that, I certainly would like to encourage people if they're ready to take that step to do it.
Yeah, or to set one up as a drip example where the drip feeds into the clay pots instead. That's worked out pretty well. And again, it's just a matter of time. Can people get there, or can they take care of it? So
Yeah, but we don't have timers on each bed, so we wouldn't be able to reduce the water just for the ones that have the drip in the clay pots. So that would be a little bit of a complication. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yeah,
Understand.
'cause it will probably overflow the pots if we're feeding all the other beds, I actually ran the numbers this morning, and if you want to hear, I figured out that on our beds right now we have 9-inch spacing on the lines. There's 4 lines. They're 10 feet long. So there's about 50 emitters per bed, and they're going at 0.65 gallons per hour. So I figured out that for each bed, it's a 0.54, about a half a gallon per minute. So if you run it like 6 or 7 minutes, that's going to be about 3 gallons. So if we're doing that twice a day, that's going to be about 6 gallons a day going into each bed. The way me filling up our clay pots, I'm sorry if I'm talking too loud. It's because I don't have good hearing. I apologize.
No, that's
I'll
fine.
try to keep my voice
You're
down.
good.
It's on the clay pots, we're having to fill it. Maybe it drops a couple inches every twice a week, and so on average, because it really varies between the pots, those pots hold about a gallon each. So if it drops a couple inches, it's probably almost half a gallon. So I figure it's about 4 gallons twice a week, maybe at the most. So maybe 8 gallons a week at the most. And so it's almost a seventh or a fifth at the rate that we're using the drip irrigation right now. So that gives you some idea of the quantities of water, the difference.
Yeah, excellent. That's just a perfect analysis. Thanks, John. That's really useful and good to hear. One of the interesting things for a lot of our desert restoration work is we might not get back for 6 or 8 weeks or even longer between times for our shrubs, and the pots would be completely dry. And we thought when we started that would be the end of it, but it turned out the roots develop in a way that they're pretty robust. And we had really good survival sometimes, even with very, very low water use. And the plants are used to. they may only make it in the natural setting every 10 or 20 years when you get a nice sequence of rainfall events. So filling the pot up every 6 weeks even was a pretty good series of rainfall events for the shrubs. Other questions? Oh,
Let's see, I'm looking, I have a list of some other things.
I have a question.
Go
sure.
ahead, Manny.
With the, I know you didn't get into the wicks thing, but I thought that was interesting. What are the wicks made out of?
The wicks have been all kinds of different things. And what I would say is take a look online. You can find one of my wick talks. But traditionally in India, they were cotton. And that's what we started out with, but they tended to get algae a little easier than some of the synthetics. So ironically, polyester and nylon ropes turned out to be really helpful for the wicks. And the water can flow down through the wicks by gravity flow. It can go 15 feet in 10 or 15 minutes. And it also goes through a capillary rise. So just like it rises up in a really thin tube, for some of the materials, you could get a rise of 10 or 20 inches. So it's not particularly useful in gardens because the flow rates are so low. We tried several times and the plants would grow and then they just run out of water. And occasionally that's happened with clay pots for the really big, fast growing vines that pumpkins and squash sometimes just overrun the water supply if it's just a little 8-inch pot. And the wicks were even worse. We thought, well, if you could just run a horizontal wick, that would be nice. So we did one layup that way. And the corn at the beginning of the wick was 2 feet tall, and then it was 1.5 feet, and then it was 1 foot, and then it was 3 inches. So it wasn't flowing enough water to be useful in that arrangement, unfortunately.
Anybody else? More questions? How high do you fill the pots? Because you have that rim sticking up above the ground,
Yeah.
which kind of stops everything, dirt and everything from getting in the pot. Works great. But when you fill up the water, do you fill it all?
I just
the
fill it
way?
right to the top. Yeah. Yeah, it probably is a little less efficient, but it also gives you a little more water for the pot. And as you say, it goes down 1 inch or 2 a day. So it'll be down fairly quickly below the rim.
Yeah, that's what I've seen, right? I was just curious, yeah.
Yeah.
So
David, can
Yeah.
I jump in? David, is there any difference or disadvantages using the regular pots versus the Oyas? Is there any advantage in that round shape with a stem?
No, there really doesn't seem to be. The disadvantage with the Oyas is you can't clean them. So you can't get inside the pot like you can with a regular clay pot from the nursery. For use inside a container plant, inside a house, the Oyas are nicer in a way, they're more aesthetic. So you could just have a little stem sticking up instead of a plate sitting in the middle of your pot or in your container. But there doesn't seem to be any real advantage. There's been a couple of studies looking at shapes, and the shapes didn't seem to matter much. It was the surface area that mattered and how well the clay was prepared.
you get a
Okay,
little
thank
more
you.
planting area though, right, with the Oyas?
Yeah, you might if it's a bigger pot. So the Oyas, which come from Canada, were relatively small. And then at the other end, you get the Deep Springs, big honking Oyas, which were really very pretty and could do a big area. Oh, he's run off to get an Oya. There we go. A baby Oya.
Walt brought me a couple of these. He found that Mexican market. These don't have holes in the bottom. They're nice little terracotta pots.
Perfect.
And I was trying to look into trying to get more of these, but the company only sells them wholesale, so I'm not sure I'll be able to get them. But I was thinking of using this and then putting a bottle in it to hold more water. And it's kind of the principle that a drinking,
Yeah, the drinking jar,
a
yeah.
crock holds with a big bottle on top. It's the same
Right,
idea. It forms a vacuum, so the water won't all drain out.
Yeah, no, that certainly might work. And there's a variety of different ceramic tips that's, fit onto wine bottles or other things. So you have the clay, but you have a much bigger container. But they tend to be fairly small surface area, and that's really important to have the bigger surface area for the roots to get a hold of. And you'll see when you pull the pots, there'll be just this incredible network of roots around where the pot was. It really develops a super root system.
So could you have plants that are like a fair distance from the pot, and they'll kind of eventually migrate their roots over to the pot?
No, they probably won't unless you give them a little trail of wet soil to work their way across. It depends on the soil type, but the plants might have to be within 2 inches or maybe 6 inches of the pot, depending on the soil type, how far out it wets. And the mulch might help with that too. The mulch might give you a little bigger spread of soil moisture. Be interesting to look at.
And then you never really get a drain through, percolating through. So, but I think I asked you in some emails before that you are even high, like here in Lemon Grove, we have about 400 parts per million total dissolved solids. And you thought that wouldn't even be a problem of salt buildup in the soil if you never really have any drain. Well, you're going to get some in the rain, obviously. Is that, and that, I guess that's sufficient when it rains to wash out the salt buildup, right?
Right, and the places where it's really high saline, they tend to end up with a salty layer outside the area where the roots grow. So the salt migrates out to the edge. So it can be a problem over a long time. You can build up more salt or calcium, but by and large, it's worked really well, and it's had very high yields, even in places with very low water quality and high saline soils. So
Yeah.
it seems to be pretty protective in that way. All right, we've dropped a few people off. I guess we've gotten to our chat. Let's see. Nope, I guess that's it. All right, John, well, thank you. And everybody who attended, nice to hear from you.
Thank you very much, David, for spending time with us today. And it's a very exciting thing that you're working with. And I really look forward to continuing to work with it. And we recorded this today, and we're posting it on our YouTube channel if anybody wants to watch it again.
Yes.
And I'll be sending out another announcement with the link to the YouTube channel.
Great. I look
And
forward to it.
David has a lot of great web pages that were on our announcement. You can read more about his work and find out how to get his books and things. And yeah, I have the Straw Bale book over here somewhere. I could pull it out, but it's a great book. And I'm actually doing some building, so I was considering about doing Straw Bale, but I just really don't have enough room because of the thick walls,
Right, right. That's a bit of a challenge on a lot.
But I am going to put some raised beds back there and do some berry pots for sure in the backyard.
Yeah, one of the things I didn't mention that I should have is one of the beauties of this is for rainwater harvesting. If you have water in a cistern, that's almost perfect water for clay pots. It's not going to clog the pores. Nice, fresh, clean water.
Mhm.
And since you get so much out of so little water, you don't have to have 1,000 gallons to grow at least a small crop of things for your home garden.
I see. Is it okay to harvest rainwater off of an asphalt roof, or are there too many chemicals in
There
that?
can be too many chemicals for a lot of the asphalts. Sometimes there's arsenic and copper. They're trying to keep the algae from growing in the shingles. So the runoff can be pretty nasty at first. An old roof, probably not a problem, but a new roof could be a big problem.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, David. And
Thank you.
David, thanks so much. And I got inspired today to think about solving a problem that I have with some raised bed containers that I'm going to put on the other side of my driveway where I can't really get irrigation to.
Oh,
And the
perfect.
clay pots are a perfect solution.
Excellent. Send me a picture.
Will do.
All right. Take care, everybody.
okay, have a great Saturday.
I will. Bye-bye. Thanks, John. Very nice. Appreciate it.
Good job,
Thank-
John.
Yeah, thank you much. Bye.
Thank you for coming. Thank you
Bye.
for coming.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Judy.
Hi, you gonna take this out to Dean?
Uh,
I noticed he wasn't here, nor Bob, both of them.